So this is Cody, the young man who changed my life forever. When we first met, I was getting my master's in social work, and I just started this new job working in foster care. Cody was 17 years old and had just spent the last 7 years living in foster care. I was his independent living case manager, which means that I was working with teenagers who were going to age out on their 18th birthday. These were kids we were never able to reunify back with their family, and we were never able to find them a permanent family through adoption, guardianship with a relative. These kids had spent 5, 10, sometimes 15 years or more living in foster care. They'd moved through sometimes 30 or more different foster care placements, group homes, foster families, sometimes detention centers. You name it, they were there. When they came into my program, we would place them into their own apartment, living by themselves, and I would provide case management. So I focused on housing, employment, education, independent living skills. The 4 things that we all need to be successful adults on the day that we turn 18. Right? Seems pretty simple. So, as you can imagine, this didn't go well for these kids. In fact, when they left my program, I would literally watch them disappear into the statistics. Homelessness, unemployment, incarceration. These were the things that we were up against, right? And honestly, it was heartbreaking to watch this happen to these kids. And I came to this crossroads really early in my career. Do I give up on this job for something less hopeless, less desperate? Or do I commit myself to trying to make the system better? And so I'm sitting in Cody's apartment one day, and we're going through his independent living goals, the checklist. I'm doing my thing as this young social worker, and Cody interrupts me abruptly. And he says, "Do you know my story?" And I said, "No, not really." And he said, "I think you need to know my story." And now in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, we don't have time for this, right? Clock's ticking, you're going to age out, we need to get to it, right? But I decide to listen. And Cody starts by telling me that he was removed from his family on his 11th birthday. And he describes that day for me. The social worker coming to school, picking him up, taking him to his first foster family's house. Abruptly, immediately separating him from his mom, his siblings, everything, everyone he had ever known, placing him with a family he had never met before in his life. And so then he goes on to tell me about the next 17 different foster care placements that he's in. And he tells me about all the different people and social workers and therapists and changing schools all the time and the stress, the confusion of all of it. And then he starts telling me about the fear that he had of turning 18, aging out, being on his own, what's going to happen, right? So he gets to the end of his story and he gets really serious. And he says to me, my life matters. People need to know what happened to me. And so we sat there with the weight of Cody's words, and this idea just appears. And Cody perks up. He says, "I think we should make a movie about my life." Okay, this is interesting. Let's kick this around. So we start talking about it. And long story, really short, 3 years after that conversation, we released a feature documentary film called From Place to Place. And we followed 3 young adults for 2.5 years post-foster care to see what happens. Right? We take this really deep dive into what life looks like for kids who age out. We see what happens when kids are fully seen and heard by people in a position of power to make the system better. And the film goes on to screen all over the country. And it has this impact on child welfare training and education and practice and policy, right, which I'll talk about. What I realized, though, is the film was just this manifestation of a simple, powerful idea. People's stories change us. Right? Cody's story changed me. It literally set the course for the next 14 years of my life. It's still a guide for me today. It's why I'm standing on this red dot right now. And it convinced for me not to give up on the broken system, right? But to double down on the thing that I think matters most to all of us here today, which is to know that we exist, to know that we belong, and to know that our lives matter. And so, right after Cody ages out, he decides he's going on this mission. He's going to go on this mission to find his dad, a man he had never met before in his life. So he finds his dad in Phoenix, Arizona. He goes down to visit him, spends 2 weeks, comes back. I meet him at the bus station, and I ask him, Cody, what was it like to meet your dad? And his answer was just one simple sentence, 4 words. It was pure joy. Joy, okay? So I asked him, Cody, why was it pure joy? And he said to me, I know what my dad looks like, and he looks like me. And I know what my dad acts like, and he acts like me. And he taught me all these things, how to clean the car, how to make pancakes, right? All these little things, and I'm thinking again in the back of my mind, Cody, these are all the things I tried to teach you, and you had no time for it when you were in foster care. And then I realized, eventually, that it was the relationship with his dad that made all the difference. Right? Cody's story taught me that our job is to prioritize relationships, to put family first. So I spent my career trying to improve the foster care system to prevent kids from aging out of foster care by putting family first. And we've achieved a lot of successes. So, we have scaled programs that have prevent hundreds of kids from aging out of foster care in North Carolina. We've changed policies that have improved the experience of the foster care system for tens of thousands of kids in North Carolina. We've literally moved millions of dollars into the system to make it better. And here we are with more kids in foster care today than when we started working on those initiatives. So even more recently, I started talking to more parents who have experienced the child welfare system, listening to their stories, learning from their experiences, and their stories have changed me. Their stories have given me a new perspective, right, that our job is not to improve the foster care system. Our job is to transform it. Right? Our job is to keep families together and to prevent foster care in the first place. So how do we transform America's child welfare system so that families can thrive? It's a big question. No real, clear, straightforward answers to it. But I think there's a place that we can start. Change starts with us. We change through people's stories. We start by listening. Right? We listen to people's stories. And when we change through their stories. When we change the system. But stories are not enough, right? There are 6 conditions of systems change. Structural changes, right? The first 3 that I just talked about. Policy, practice, changing the flow of money, right? These are necessary, important changes, but not the place that we start. Right? We have to ask ourselves, before we make those changes, who has the power to make decisions about those changes? Who ultimately benefits from those decisions? Right? So that takes us to the next 2, right? Relationships and power dynamics. We have to bring the right people together, right? We have to bring a diverse set of perspectives. We have to bring together people that have lived the experience of the child welfare system. Right? We have to create this inclusive table. That's the secret sauce, I think, of systems change. It's the place that we can build relationships, we can build trust, and from that foundation, we can shift power, right? Shift power to people that have lived the experience of the system to inform decisions that we might make about structural changes. But before we can do that, we have to shift mental models, right? That's hard work to do. We have to shift our mindsets first, right? So our mindsets are just our deeply held beliefs, our patterns of thought. These are our behaviors, our decisions, right? So how do we shift our mindsets? That's where I think the power of story becomes so important, right? We listen to somebody's story, we put ourselves in somebody else's shoes, right? It gives us a different perspective about how to see the world, right? And that has the power to shift our mindset, right? To maybe create that inclusive table to go a different direction around structural changes. So we start with stories. So let me give you an example of this. So when we started making the film, I asked all of the young people in the film, why do you want to share your story? Like, why would you want to put your life on the big screen, right? It's very personal stuff. And so they all had 2 answers in common. One, they said, nobody ever asked me what it was like to be in foster care. They wanted to know that their lives mattered, right? And then they said, I want to share my story with people in a position of power to make the system better for the next generation. So this was our true north. And so we started asking ourselves, okay, so when you're a kid, who has all the power? Right? Your parents, right? You remember when we butted heads with our parents as teenagers? Parents have all the power. So if you're a kid in foster care, who are your parents? Right? The government is your parents, ultimately. So we thought, okay, we should probably talk to the government. And so this woman, Becky Shipp, was working on Capitol Hill, and she was a staff to the Senate Caucus on Foster Youth. And she invited Mandy and Rafe, two of the young people in the film, to come to Capitol Hill to testify, to share their testimony to the Senate Caucus on Foster Youth. And so they did, and we go and we film it, and they share their story, and it's compelling and raw and authentic, and they provide really deep insight, things that folks didn't know on the Hill. And so Mandy at one point in her testimony says, if I don't have a family, who's going to teach me about dating or the prom? She said, who's going to walk me down the aisle one day? And then Rafe said something that still gets me today. He said, I may look tough. I may have this big tattoo on the side of my face, but I have a heart that would swallow everybody in this room. And he does. And they shared their story that day. And I think what they did was they challenged all of us to see beyond the surface, right? To see beyond the face tattoo, to connect with them on this much more deeper human level, to put ourselves in their shoes, see the world from their perspective, right? And that shifts mindsets. It shifted Becky's mindset. It changed her behaviors from that day. So what she did was she organized this series of 6 listening sessions. And she brought young people from all over the country to Capitol Hill to share their story, share their experiences, their ideas, their critiques of the system. And it was the content of those conversations that led to what became the Family First Act. Right? So the Family First Act is one of the most significant pieces of child welfare legislation in decades. It has the potential to be transformative. Now, we'll see what happens. It's literally being implemented today. October 1st was a go-live date for it, so we'll see. But I think what's really interesting about that is the process rather than the structural change, right? The process started with somebody sharing their story, with somebody listening, right? Becky shifting her mindset, changing her behavior, creating this inclusive table, right? Building relationships. And it was that then that led to the structural change. So I think that's where we need to start again with story. We can replicate that process, but this time, instead of asking this question, how do we prevent kids from aging out of foster care? We ask the question, how do we prevent foster care in the first place? And we ask parents and families and communities that question, right? And so when we do that, I think what we'll find is that there are opportunities. So one of the things that we know is that families come to the attention of the child welfare system for neglect far more often than they do for abuse, physical harm to children. 60% of all Child Protective Service responses are for neglect only, right? Not for physical abuse or harm, which we most often think about. So what is neglect? Neglect really looks like the overburdened parent, the overburdened family. Families dealing with difficult, stressful, largely systemic conditions, right? Things like access to health care or child care or safe housing, access to mental health services or substance use services, right? This is often more about these difficult, stressful conditions than it is about bad parenting or bad parenting behaviors. And so another thing that we know is that family income is one of the greatest predictors of child welfare involvement. So when states decrease economic investments to support families, we tend to see an increase in child welfare involvement. And when states increase investments to support families, we tend to see child welfare involvement decrease. So that's a pretty broad blanket statement, clearly. But there is a long-standing body of research that shows us this association. And for example, a $1 increase in the minimum wage is associated with a 9 to 10% decrease in child maltreatment. Yet, we aren't prioritizing family and family well-being with our investments. In fact, in 2018, we spent $33 billion on child welfare expenditures. This was largely spent on foster care. And of that $33 billion, less than 15% was spent on activities that would prevent the need for foster care. So how do we flip that percentage, or at least start to shift our priorities, our resources, our investments upstream, up front, to support families, to keep families together? Do we have to accept that there are 700,000 kids separated from their families in foster care every single year? So I want to end with just a few thoughts. First, our care and concern for the safety of children, it's undoubtedly important, and it always will be. When we have to keep kids safe, we need ways to keep kids safe. But what I would suggest is we can demonstrate our care and concern for children by investing in the well-being of their parents. And we can start today, simply. We can ask parents what they need, right? Listen to their stories. We can learn from their experiences, from their expertise. We can create that inclusive table, right? And we can find ways to take action together with families. We can shift power. And we can find ways to alleviate, reduce, mitigate these difficult, stressful, systemic conditions that so many families are facing. And when we do that, we'll find that there's a world of opportunity to believe in families and to prevent foster care in the first place. Thank you.